Thank you, Masako, and also Claudio for the kind invitation to participate in this project. And I think it's a very fascinating project. And I'm happy actually to share the view or the position in Australia, even though I have left Australia now almost 2 years ago. But I think this issue of digital platforms and news is really what put Australian competition law and the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission worldwide on, it highlighted these two because, yeah, the ACCC was probably the first competition authority around in the world to really have a in-depth market inquiry into digital platforms and news. And I believe Australia was also the first country that actually implemented a bargaining code that allows news media businesses to negotiate fair remuneration for news content with digital platforms. And from what I've seen in the news is that other countries are contemplating to follow Australia's example. So this presentation today is based on a recent paper that I published together with Ty Nielsen, who is a senior lecturer in media and communication studies at Macquarie University in Sydney. And as Masako said, it was published in the World Competition and Economics Review last month. And a modified version of this paper is also forthcoming in a book. And I have the link at the last slide of my presentation. Okay, so in summer 2020, Google threatened to remove its search engine service from Australia. You might have seen that in the news, especially when you were in Australia at the time. It was almost inevitable not to hear about this in the news. So what happened that made Google to make this threat? Well, earlier, a year earlier, the final report of the Digital Platforms Inquiry, the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, outlined the significant challenges faced by Australian news organizations as a result of the competition posed by digital platforms, particularly Google and Facebook. And then following the recommendations in the report, the federal government published the draft News Media Bargaining Code in summer 2020. And the code was intended to allow Australian news media businesses to negotiate remuneration with digital platforms for content that was made available on those platforms. And as you can imagine, Google and Facebook were obviously not happy about this idea, and they heavily lobbied against the adoption of this code. And the final version, which is called the News Media and Digital Platforms Mandatory Bargaining Code 2021, eventually then became an amendment to the Competition and Consumer Act, and it entered into force on the 1st of March 2021. However, this code, the final code, is very much a watered down version of the draft code. So there you can see that especially Google's efforts to lobby against the code proved successful. So from Masako and also Claudio's presentation last week, 2 weeks ago, we have already learned about the delicate relationship between news organizations and digital platforms. So news organizations, on the one hand, compete with digital platforms for advertising money, online advertising revenue. But at the same time, news organizations, they depend on digital platforms to reach online audiences. And in Australia, similar to many other Western countries, but unlike in Japan, as we learned from Masako's presentation, Google and Facebook clearly dominate the advertising revenue market. So in the total advertising market, Google has a market share of 53%. Facebook and its subsidiary Instagram have 28%. And other companies, including news media companies, make up 19%. And then if we break this down into the search advertising market and the display advertising market, we see that Google receives around 96% of the search advertising revenue, and Facebook and Instagram receive around 51% of the display advertising revenue. And in terms of the news media organizations' dependence on digital platforms to reach online audiences, the ACCC estimates that 32% of visitors to Australian newspapers, news sites online are directed to these sites by Google, and 18% are directed by Facebook. So on this slide, you can see the distribution of advertising revenue in Australia. So we can clearly see that in the last 15 years, the advertising expenditure went from print media to online. And of that online expenditure, the biggest chunks, they go to Google and to Facebook. In the digital platform inquiry, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission found that because of the news media organizations' dependence on reaching online audiences via digital platforms, Google and Facebook each have substantial bargaining power in their dealings with news media businesses. So it basically means that Google and Facebook are able to dictate the terms on which they deal with news media businesses. Or in other words, for news media businesses, whenever they deal with Google and Facebook are able to say, take it or leave it in terms of what they're offering. In terms of the technological side, in that dependence, the ACCC identified 3 aspects of digital platforms that have made it more difficult for news organizations to operate a profitable online presence. Namely, the lack of warning to news media businesses of changes to key algorithms relating to the display of news and also to news referral links. The implementation of policies and formats that have made a significant and adverse impact on the ability of news media businesses to monetize their content and or to build or sustain a online presence, online audience, and the impact of such policies on the incentive for news organizations to create news content, particularly where significant effort is expended to reach and produce original content. And then the report also states that in the last decade, over 100 newspapers in Australia have closed, and that there has been a 15% decline in the total number of newspapers, that there has been a 9% decline in the employment of journalists, and overall that because of these developments, there has been a considerable reduction in the coverage of public interest news. And what do I mean by public interest news? It's the kind of news that you would call serious journalism. So the kind of journalism that deals with, let's say, political issues, as opposed to, let's say, journalism about pop culture. And later on, I will make the link between public interest news and the democracy. So in my paper today, I want to set the news media bargaining code in context of what has been happening in the Australian media sector over the past 2 decades, and as well as the potential of the code to safeguard media diversity. And yeah, as I just alluded to, media diversity is a critical aspect of at least Western democracies. Now, before I go into the news media bargaining code, I want to first elaborate upon the, well, 2 types of state interventions that are available to legislators, namely regulation on the one hand, and competition law on the other hand. So initially in Australia, commercial radio and television have been regulated by the Broadcasting Services Act 1992 and the Telecommunications Act 1997, and not the Competition and Consumer Act. So regulation, like competition law, is a type of state intervention to solve market failures. And to put it simply, regulation is state intervention intended to produce specific goals or outcomes. And when we make the distinction between, let's say, economic regulation and social regulation, we speak of social regulation social regulation is justified where the marketplace has failed to produce social outcomes that are in accordance with the public interest. So if we put this concretely in the media sector, regulation is often justified by policymakers in terms of normative claims about how media companies should perform or what type of media should be made available to the public. So this is particularly important in the area of news media, where regulation aims to give audiences the choice of a range of news sources, covering different news stories, or covering events from different angles. So in many, again, at least Western countries, we see that, we especially see it in the US, but we also see it in Australia, that often newspapers are leaning more towards the left or the right. And from that point of view, also given how they lean towards towards the government or opposition, it is important that we have not just one media outlet, but that we have a large number of media outlets, so that the public does not just hear one view, but that the public is exposed to different views, and that ultimately the public or each individual listener or reader of newspapers can make up his or her own mind, and then ultimately when it comes to voting, makes up his or her own mind and then goes to the ballot station, rather than being exposed to just one newspaper or one broadcasting station, and is then completely biased and then takes this bias to the ballot station. So if left entirely to competition, then media companies might focus on the most popular content, possibly at the expense of content that is in the public interest. And so what we might see is that as a result of competition, news media businesses, in order to gain as many readers or viewers as possible, they would just cater to the most popular content. And this content might not be in the public interest. Again, it might be content, let's say pop culture, that let's say most people are interested in terms of entertainment, but it's not something that informs them about what is going on in the political sphere, and which is quite important for how democracy works. So in order to prevent this race to the bottom as a result of competition, it might be a good idea to implement regulations that ensure a certain level of, let's say, media diversity. However, regulations also have shortcomings. One shortcoming is that regulations apply ex ante to designated entities. So if an entity is not designated in the regulation, then the entity falls outside the regulation. And in the media regulation, digital platforms such as Google and Facebook have quite often avoided accountability applied to news media businesses because the label of media company does not apply to platforms, to digital platforms. And they have therefore avoided regulations that govern news media businesses. And another drawback of regulation is that there are various causes for regulatory failure at any point of the regulatory process. So regulation may be ineffective due to inadequate information or misdiagnosis of the underlying policy issues because of regulatory capture. And this is what we have seen with the news media bargaining code in terms of the involvement of Google and Facebook lobbying against it. But there might also be poor design or choice of regulatory instruments and improper implementation. Now, the recent history of media policy in Australia is largely characterized by a transition from media-specific regulation to greater reliance on competition and competition law as a result. So policymakers in Australia have faced a rapidly shifting media environment, namely that the geographical boundaries as a result of internet have been eroded. So readers of news have been able to not just, well, they are not dependent on just local news or regional news, but because of the internet, they can more easily access national news and even international news. There has also been a convergence of media formats. And thirdly, there has been a consolidation of media ownership. And in Australia, that's particularly worse compared to many other Western countries, because in Australia, Rupert Murdoch has quite a big stake in owning media businesses. So policymakers in Australia have responded to these changes, A, by repealing regulations limited to the concentration of media ownership, and B, by creating a larger role for competition law in governing the media industry. So over the past 15 years, Australian governments have repealed almost all regulations that specifically limited the concentration of media ownership. So there has been a shift from media-specific regulation that intended to ensure media diversity towards a focus on market mechanisms for promoting competition. So prior to the deregulation, media ownership prior to the deregulation of media ownership, the Competition and Consumer Act only played a role in the media sector in the form of merger control. So the first deregulation started in 2006 with when the government passed the media reform package that included major changes to the Broadcasting Services Act. So this media package removed the regulation on media concentration from the remit of the Broadcasting Services Act, so that these issues would be governed by the more general Trade Practices Act, which is now the Competition and Consumer Act. The media package also loosened cross-media ownership rules so that one person or one company could acquire 2 out of 3 types of licensed media in the same regional market. So that is television, radio, and newspapers, as long as there remained an appropriate level of media diversity. Then in 2017, the government repealed most of the remaining industry-specific regulations on media ownership. This included first the 75% reach rule that prohibited one person or company from controlling media assets reaching more than 75% of the population in a licensed area or 60% of the entire Australian population. Second, the 2/3 rule that limited one person to being able to own 2 regulated media platforms in one license area. These reforms were justified by the government due to the impact of digital media. It was suggested that advances in technology had made regional markets less important, as Australians can now access digital content from around the world, and that digital media had increased competition amongst media outlets. So these 2 media packages removed sector-specific regulation and therefore increased the importance of the ACCC in governing the media sector. And this is one of the reasons why it was the ACCC that conducted the digital platform inquiry and not another regulator in Australia. Now, on this slide, I try to illustrate the development that went on in Australia, namely from sector-specific regulation towards competition. So as a result of the 2 media packages that I just talked about. But what you can see here is also that because of the News Media Bargaining Code, we now see a slight swing back towards regulation. Because strictly speaking, the News Media Bargaining Code is not just entirely a competition law instrument, it's rather a hybrid between competition law and sector-specific regulation. However, that being said, the Competition Consumer Act still is now mainly in charge of dealing with the media sector, and regulation has or at least regulation as to media diversity has pretty much been removed. It should also be said that I earlier talked about the advantages and disadvantages of regulation. Now, what you also can see from this slide is, a market might experience successive waves of regulation, deregulation, and competition enforcement. So competition law might be applicable in regulated markets, or conversely, wholly or partly excluded by the presence of regulation. Or competition law may function as a substitute for regulation or vice versa. Or there can be legal powers of a hybridized nature. So in our opinion, the News Media Bargaining Code is such a legal instrument of a hybridized nature. But we should also note that there are limitations to the substitutability of competition law and regulation. And these are predicated on the context and the objectives of a given intervention. So from a market efficiency perspective, competition is considered to deliver better outcomes than regulatory solutions, and market failures are better handled by competition law. However, even in the strict sense, regulation is indispensable in circumstances where competition law lacks the capability to correct market failures, or where competition law has limited jurisdiction. So competition law is typically less effective at solving competition issues that stem from structural market difficulties or involve exploitative rather than exclusionary conduct. So in such circumstances, only regulatory measures can effectively reinstate competition into a market or secure more socially desirable outcomes. And where the maximization of consumer welfare is the exclusive goal of a competition law, then strictly speaking, competition law may not pursue any other policy objectives, even if those other policy objectives are worthwhile pursuing. So, as I said earlier, regulatory measures, by contrast to competition law, are generally more extensive and can specify precise obligations. And as such, an incumbent firm may have affirmative duties under regulation that could not be imposed under competition law. And also concerns such as fake news or hate speech or intrusion of user privacy are better regulated or are better addressed through specific non-economic regulation rather than competition law. However, at the same time, other concerns about media diversity are more tightly bound up with market power of digital platforms. So in light of that, it might actually make sense that the media sector is regulated by both regulation or media-specific regulation, as well as competition and competition law. So in light of the deregulation in the media industry and the transition to a market approach, a preliminary issue that this digital platform inquiry should have addressed is whether the Competition and Consumer Act is even applicable in order to safeguard quality journalism or public interest journalism or media diversity. So at the beginning of the report, the ACCC simply stated that the existing tools and goals of the competition framework remain applicable for digital markets. However, the ACCC did not provide any arguments why this is the case. So in Section 2 of the Competition and Consumer Act, the stated objective of Australian competition law is to enhance the welfare of Australians through the promotion of competition and fair trading and provision for consumer protection. And as far as Section 46, which deals with the misuse of market power, is concerned, the goal is to protect the competitive process for the benefit of consumers. So the idea that competition law is intended primarily as a mechanism for promoting consumer welfare has gained traction around the world, including Australia, since the ascendancy of the Chicago School. However, there is no consensus on the definition of consumer welfare, how it should be assessed, and whether competition law may be used to pursue non-economic goals such as media diversity. And in addition to the objective of consumer welfare, political discourses surrounding Australian competition law have historically always promoted the egalitarian notion of a fair go. So the principle of a fair go pertains to protecting smaller businesses against larger competitors. And this is something that we have seen throughout most of the history of Australian competition law. And it was most explicitly articulated on Section 51, in the guidance on Section 51 AC of the old Trade Practices Act, and intended to address harsh and unfair behavior by larger parties against smaller businesses. However, this ideal is very controversial and in some cases may obviously clash with market efficiency and the pursuit of consumer welfare. So during the last reform of Australian competition law in 2017, it was explicitly stated that the goal of Australian competition law is the protection of consumer welfare, and that the protection of competitors is not a goal of Australian competition law. So, and when reviewing all the laws, all the Australian competition provisions in the Competition and Consumer Act, the review panel, the Harper panel, identified 4 attributes of effective competition policy. And those 4 attributes are whether the law focuses on enhancing consumer well-being over the long term, whether the law protects competition instead of individual competitors, whether the law strikes the right balance between prohibiting anti-competitive conduct and not interfering with efficiency, innovation, and entrepreneurship, and lastly, whether the law is as clear, simple, and predictable as it possibly can be. An example of a provision in the Competition and Consumer Act, in the current Competition and Consumer Act, that fulfills all those 4 criteria is the provision on collective bargaining in Section 93 AB of the Act. So what is collective bargaining? Collective bargaining refers to a process where 2 or more firms get together to deal with a third-party supplier or third-party customer in circumstances where they would ordinarily deal with that third party on an individual basis. So these arrangements are typically caught by the cartel laws or by Section 45, which deals with anti-competitive agreements in Australia. However, in recognition that it may be desirable to enable smaller businesses to negotiate together in order to gain a degree of countervailing power against the larger firm with which they are negotiating, collective bargaining has been implemented in the Competition and Consumer Act in 2006. So provided the other requirements are met, the ACCC will not object to collective bargaining where it is satisfied that the benefits of collective bargaining, where it is satisfied that the benefits of to the public outweigh the detriments. So the idea behind collective bargaining is not to protect smaller businesses just for the sake of it. Anti-competitive detriments are balanced against efficiencies, such as the reduction in transaction costs, which could be passed on to consumers in the form of lower prices. So from that perspective, it shows that it is not about protecting smaller businesses, but it's rather about consumer welfare. But this framework alone is not sufficient for the purpose of assessing whether the current Competition and Consumer Act is suitable to pursue media diversity. So more specifically, in our paper, we wanted to know whether public interest journalism or media diversity could be conducive to consumer welfare within the meaning of the Competition and Consumer Act. And looking at case law, looking at Australian case law, it can be said that the term public benefit has been given a very broad definition, and that it can apply to anything of value to the community generally. So the ACCC has accepted a number of non-economic public benefits, including in case law, the protection of children from harmful and offensive advertisement. And in the digital platform inquiry, the ACCC states that public interest journalism is important to a well-functioning democracy and is therefore welfare enhancing. So to that extent, to the extent that media diversity is welfare enhancing and the measure to pursue media diversity can be reconciled with the competitive process, interventions by the ACCC in digital platform markets would be justified. So then, on the 31st of July 2020, the ACCC released the draft News Media Bargaining Code. And the ACCC justified the publication of the code by saying that the purpose of the code was to counter the significant bargaining power that major digital platforms have vis-a-vis news businesses. And the ACCC stated that while bargaining power imbalances exist in other areas, the bargaining power imbalance between news media businesses and major digital platforms is being addressed as a strong and independent media landscape is essential to a well-functioning democracy. So here again, we see the emphasis on media diversity and how media diversity contributes to a well-functioning democracy, which is arguably welfare enhancing. So the proposed revenue sharing between digital platforms and news media organizations was the most controversial aspect of the code. And that was also the reason why Google, particularly Google as well as Facebook, campaigned against the bill. And the campaign proved successful as the Australian government parliament adopted a watered down version in March last year. So the final version, the News Media and Digital Platforms Mandatory Bargaining Code 2021, sets out requirements that a news media business has to meet, first of all, in order to be eligible to fall under the scope of the code. Namely that a news media business would be eligible to participate under the code if its online content investigates and explains issues of public significance for Australians, issues that engage Australians in public debate and inform democratic decision-making, or issues relating to community and local events. And this criteria is called the content test. The second criterion is that a news media business must operate in Australia for the main purpose of serving Australian audiences. That's why this criteria is also called the Australian Audience Test. And then thirdly, the news media business must also adhere to minimum levels of professional editorial standards and maintain a suitable degree of editorial independence. And this criterion is called the Professional Standards Test. The purpose of all these three criteria is to ensure that only Australian news media businesses that produce public interest journalism would benefit from the code. On the opposite side, the code establishes that in making the determination about subjecting certain digital platforms under its scope, the minister must consider whether there is a significant bargaining imbalance, bargaining power imbalance between Australian news media businesses and digital platforms and the digital platform in question. In addition, the minister must also consider whether the platform has made a significant contribution to the sustainability of the Australian news industry through agreements relating to news content of Australian news businesses. So as I said earlier, the central element of the code is the bargaining regime that allows news media businesses to negotiate with digital platforms over fair payment for news content. And if the parties cannot agree on remuneration in good faith within 3 months, and a subsequent process of mediation is also unsuccessful, then an independent arbitrator must decide within 35 business days which of the two parties' final offer is more reasonable. And in making that decision, the arbitrator must consider the respective costs and benefits for the parties in the production and dissemination of news content, and whether a particular remuneration amount would place an undue burden on the commercial interest of the digital platform. Then, as I said earlier, there are also technical implications that have made it difficult for news media businesses to build an online audience. And in light of that, the News Media Bargaining Code has come up with some minimum standards that digital platforms must adhere to. So, in particular, the code stipulates that minimum standards to govern non-payment related issues between digital platforms and news media businesses relate to standards that under those standards, digital platforms need to provide more access to data about news audiences. That a digital platform must provide news media businesses with lists and explanations of data it collects through user interactions on the platform. And that in addition, a digital platform is required to give news media businesses 14 days advance notice of algorithmic changes that are likely to have a significant effect on news referral links from the designated platform for the content covered, for the news content covered on that platform. So then, as I said earlier, the code, the News Media Bargaining Code, is arguably a hybrid between industry-specific legislation and competition law. So on the one hand, the code is part of the Competition and Consumer Act and features a collective bargaining system. And at first sight, this bargaining system protects smaller firms against larger corporations. But similar to its counterpart, Section 93, which I mentioned earlier, the bargaining regime in the code has the purpose of protecting competition rather than protecting competitors. The collective bargaining applies to the supply of news content between different levels of the market. So the news media businesses would basically be at the upstream level of creating news content, and at the downstream level, you would have the digital platforms. And so the News Media Bargaining Code would allow the news media businesses to collectively negotiate remuneration with digital platforms, and in such a case, this collective bargaining would not be caught by the cartel laws or Section 45. On the other hand, several aspects of the code appear to be rather elements of sector-specific regulation. So unlike competition law, regulatory measures may be used to A, impose obligations that go beyond competition, and B, to advance objectives beyond consumer welfare. So the requirements imposed on digital platforms to compensate and to adhere to minimum standards in their dealings with news businesses is an obligation that competition law cannot impose ex ante. And the regulatory nature of the code also exposes it to at least one major weakness, namely that apart from arbitrariness, the designation based on contribution to the sustainability of the news media industry in Australia makes the code prone to regulatory capture. So compared to the draft code, the final version is much less effective in reducing the disparity in the bargaining power of large digital platforms vis-a-vis news media businesses. So at the time of drafting the code, it was clear that the code would initially apply to Google and Facebook, because those two platforms had significant bargaining power over Australian news media businesses. However, in a reversal, the final bill did not single out Google or Facebook. So currently also Google and Facebook are still not subject to the news media bargaining code. And the inclusion of the criterion in the final version that the minister must consider whether the platform has made a significant contribution to the sustainability of the Australian news industry. This is really something that responded to Google's aggressive campaign, namely that before the Australian Parliament voted on the final code, Google made some last-minute agreements with larger Australian news media businesses, and could therefore claim that they contributed to the sustainability of the Australian news media sector. Yeah, as I said just a minute ago, until now, the minister still hasn't designated any platform to fall under the news media bargaining code, and therefore, as it stands now, no news media bargaining code has a right to claim fair remuneration from Google or Facebook. So it's also, it's based compared to the draft version. It's a pity that this new criteria was added instead of designating right at the beginning that Google or Facebook or any other digital platform that has significant bargaining power would fall under the code. And it's also a pity because it's not a very objective criterion to assess to what extent a digital platform has made a significant contribution to the Australian news media industry. So till this date, we don't know how it is actually measured. Is it measured in terms of how much money or how much worth the agreement between a digital platform and the news media organization is, whether it is a contribution that allows the news media organization to basically cover its costs, or whether it's only an amount that allows the media organization to cover a certain percentage of its costs. So that's why it's a shame that the final code is different from the draft code in that respect. Also, another difference between the draft code and the final code is that in the final code, a digital platform can differentiate in their dealings between different news organizations. So they can actually discriminate against, let's say, smaller news media businesses. So they are not obliged to offer the same deal that they offer a large media organization also to a smaller one. Whereas in the draft code, a digital platform was not allowed to differentiate between bigger or smaller news media organizations. So that's why we think that at least on paper, the draft code was more effective than the final version of the code. But yeah, we have to, in practice, we have to wait and see whether the code will be effective. based on, let's say, the viability of newspapers going forward, if we continue seeing newspapers going out of business, then yeah, this is a sign that the code in its current form is perhaps not fulfilling its objective of safeguarding media plurality or media diversity. So far we have seen mixed results in terms of how the code is applied in practice. So on the one hand, Google and Facebook have recently concluded an agreement with Country Press Australia, which is an industry organization that represents 80 newspaper publishers, local and independent newspaper community publishers in Australia. But on the other hand, we have also seen that Google and Facebook have, in the majority of the cases, concluded remuneration agreements with the larger news organizations. And the government recently said that some news organizations, including smaller and independent publishers, have expressed a concern that they're being left out of this bargaining of this remuneration process. So in conclusion, we can see that in the last 15 years, there has been a process of deregulation, and that sector-specific regulation in the media sector to ensure media diversity has been repealed, and that the industry has become subject to more and more competition, and therefore competition law rather than regulation have been used. We have seen that the new news media bargaining code can be seen as a hybrid between competition law and regulation. And yeah, we have seen, or at least on paper, the final code is not as effective as the draft version. So it remains to be seen whether the objective of safeguarding media diversity is being fulfilled, or whether the code might need to be adjusted in the near future. With that, yeah, thank you for your attention, and yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. Also on this slide, you can see the links to both the paper and the book chapter.